This is the story of Thomas Perrine, who lived in the cupola of the Pennsylvania hospital for 9 years and later passed away up there. Now I get it. The story sounds pretty far-fetched. It sounds like one of those fictional stories you hear on a ghost tour. But based on the research I've done, everything about this story is true. And once you begin to see the context of how this happened, it will make more sense. To give you a bit of background on this story, the East Wing of the Pennsylvania Hospital was completed on November 29, 1756, and soon occupied by patients. Set at the northeast corner of Pine and 8th Street, the building was 2.5 stories high, with the male ward on the first floor, the female ward on the second floor, and the patients who were considered to be mentally unstable were put in the basement. The basement accommodations need to be discussed, because the conditions that the mentally ill patients lived in is somewhat nuanced. The cells had plank floors to prevent rats from coming in, and the walls were plastered. A roof over the patient's head and an enclosed space, of course, provided protection from the elements. However, the problem was that it was impossible to heat the cells. In the 18th century, the only way to realistically heat an area was with a wood-burning fire. Not only would that have been logistically impossible to have a wood-burning fire in the basement cell of a mentally ill patient, it would have been criminally irresponsible and presented obvious safety issues. As a result, the cells remained cold in the winter, with temperatures dropping into the teens and perhaps the single digits on some nights. The patients would have been brutally cold. At the time, it was rationalized that conditions in the basement were still far better accommodations than what most mentally unstable people were accustomed to. And to be fair, they were. If a mentally ill patient was not in the hospital, they most likely would have been outside, fully exposed to the elements. What a 21st century listener must understand is that the staff of the hospital had the best intentions for the patients. There was simply nothing they could do to correct the situation. As early as the 1790s, there was discussion on how to heat the cells better, but it was quickly determined that proposals would have caused gases that could have potentially killed all the patients in the basement. With that context out of the way, it was in March 1765 that a man named Thomas Perrine was admitted to the hospital as a mentally ill patient. There isn't anything known about his life prior to being admitted, but one thing is certain. He was violent and unable to care for himself. Thomas was described as a, quote, remarkably neat and tidy sailor. Confined to one of the aforementioned cells in the basement, Thomas would have outbursts and fight with the hospital staff and other patients. So this is where things get a little bit strange. One day, not long after being admitted to the hospital, Thomas escaped his cell and fled to the cupola of the hospital building. The staff attempted to bring him down, but his violent and combative nature made it impossible to remove him. One thing the staff noticed about Thomas being in the cupola, unlike in the basement, was that he suddenly seemed content. A blanket was provided to Thomas and daily meals were sent up there. Soon it was decided that Thomas could simply stay in the cupola. Of his time up in the cupola, a first-hand account wrote, quote, he never left those cramped quarters for any purpose. He was also noted for his long nails, matted hair, and for his insensibility to cold, since he never, in the coldest weather of 9 winters, came near to a fire. It would seem that a man that was once described as tidy had turned into the exact opposite. When I read this description, I was reminded of Howard Hughes, who also suffered from mental instability and remained confined to one small area for decades, refusing to shave, cut his hair, or cut his nails. Thomas Perrine would remain in the cupola for about 9 years. He would have had a nice view of the city and the hospital grounds. Sadly, one morning in 1774, when staff was sent up to the cupola to give Thomas his morning meal, they found that he had passed away. I attempted to get more information about Thomas and did find a Thomas Perrine without the E at the end of his last name in Quaker records. This Thomas also lived in Philadelphia and died there in 1774. However, it isn't clear if this is the same person. Believe it or not, the east wing of the Pine building still exists to this day, 270 years later, and hasn't changed much since it was built in 1756. The basement where the cells were located is off limits to the public, and I can't say for sure if the cells themselves are still down there or not. The cupola that Thomas Perrine lived in is also still there, and it is often lit up at night. Access to this is also off limits. Walking down 8th Street on my way to the Pennsylvania Hospital at 5:30 a.m. for surgery in 2026, I couldn't help but remember Thomas's story as I stared up at the lit cupola. To be honest, it was a bit eerie. The story of Thomas Perrine and his time in the cupola remains one of the forgotten stories of Philadelphia history.